Storer. I'm an associate professor in glaciology here at Sheffield Hallam University, and I run our second year field trip to Iceland. I'm going to be talking about how climate change, natural hazards, and tourism have all coincided in recent years to have some quite significant impacts on the Icelandic landscape and on life for people in Iceland. So Iceland is well known as a very beautiful natural landscape. So it's a really dynamic place, and it's of interest to physical geographers like myself because it has active volcanism, it has glaciers, it has an interesting climate in a subarctic environment, it has lots of rivers, lots of ocean processes going on as well. So it's a really good place to study physical geography. I've been very lucky to visit Iceland numerous times over the last 12 or 13 years or so, and it's a really beautiful landscape that's allowed me to capture some really nice pictures in my hobby as a photographer. And it's not just me that Iceland has impressed, so it's, as you may expect, really popular on social media. And over the last 10 years or so, Iceland has really taken off as a tourism destination driven by popularity on platforms such as Instagram and by celebrity cameos, such as music videos featuring Justin Bieber, and as a film set for films or TV programs such as Game of Thrones. So this means that tourism has really kicked off because we see these amazing pictures, these idealised landscapes. And tourism in Iceland has exploded in the last 10 years. So this graph shows the number of visitors per year to Iceland since 1950. And you can see since 2010, the numbers have really kicked off, kind of going 5 or 6 times the previous numbers, with around 2 to 2.5 million people visiting Iceland per year. There's a dip for the COVID pandemic, but still no sign that tourism is going to be slowing down in Iceland anytime soon. What's interesting is that if we superimpose on this graph a red line that shows the Icelandic population on the same axis, this shows that the number of tourists now outnumbers the number of local residents of Iceland, and has done since around the year 2000. So the Icelandic population is around 350,000, making it one of the most sparsely populated countries in Europe. And today there are way more tourists visiting Iceland than there are local people. So this has had a big impact on life for local people, as well as the Icelandic economy and life in Iceland. In academia, this has led to some ideas around what the effects of that will be. And the effects are relatively complex. There's lots of talk about the concept of over-tourism in Iceland. Has the rate of this tourism been too fast for the country to adapt to? Is it causing problems? So it certainly is causing some issues, such as degradation of the natural landscape, economic problems, because accommodation is needed for tourists, and that is starting to price local people out of living in places like Reykjavik, which is where many people work. So there are some impacts of tourism. There are some positive impacts as well. So tourism brings money to the economy. It provides jobs. So there's some nuance here, but the explosion in tourism and the rate that that's happened has been very fast. So there's lots of work going on to kind of evaluate what the impact of that is and whether it's sustainable. Iceland featured just before the pandemic in The Independent in a list of where not to go in 2020 because of this perceived issue of over-tourism. And this is quite ironic in some senses, because a lot of the tourism that Iceland receives and a lot of the reasons that people go to Iceland is to witness a beautiful natural landscape. The irony is that the influx of lots and lots of visitors to Iceland has a negative impact on that landscape, both indirectly through the carbon emissions of travelling to get there, but also directly on the landscape by the fact that when you have lots more visitors, you need more infrastructure, they produce more waste, and if they're going to honeypot locations, of which Iceland has lots, to take the same photos that people see on Instagram, then those locations end up degrading and suffering as a consequence. So there's a case study here on the dilemma of nature-based tourism, which is quite ironic that people in wanting to see this pristine natural environment, are counteracting the pristine nature of it. In fact, the Icelandic environment isn't really a pristine natural environment. Many of the dynamic processes that are shaping the environment are, of course, very natural. But since people populated Iceland around 1,000 years ago, deforestation has been a problem, overgrazing, and soil erosion. So the Icelandic landscape today is very beautiful, and there are lots of natural processes, but it's not a purely natural landscape. So there's lots of interesting debates about what the right thing to do is. How can we have sustainable tourism? One of the things that you see on Instagram is people going on adventure type holidays, and Iceland is certainly a really exciting place to go for that purpose. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is glacier tourism, because I'm a glaciologist. I study glaciers and how they work. Lots of companies offer glacier tours, so you could go hiking or exploring ice caves underneath glaciers. And the image on the left here is kind of typical of the tourist advertisements, people having an amazing time seeing this amazing natural landscape. The picture on the right is some of our students having an amazing time visiting one of these beautiful landscapes last year. The conflict for me here is that when tourists visit a glacier, they see this thing that's beautiful, but they see it only once, and they don't see how it's changing. And one of the things that I'm interested in is to see how we can affect people's perceptions of a landscape and of how they go about their life and how society works as a consequence of understanding a little bit more about this landscape. So it's not just a beautiful landscape, but it's a very dynamic landscape. This photograph was taken in 1980 of a glacier in Iceland. And if I transition that to a more recent photo from just a few years ago, you can see that this is a very dynamic landscape. The Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else on the planet, and Iceland is just south of the Arctic Circle, so it has seen a lot of glacier retreat. Glaciers in Iceland have been melting and retreating since the 1930s because of climate warming, and that's driven by fossil fuel burning. So there's an irony also that people are flying to Iceland, burning lots of fossil fuel, to then look at something that is suffering as a consequence of those activities. So there's lots of tensions in this area. Another thing to bear in mind is that Iceland is quite an expensive country, and most of the tourists who visit Iceland are moderately or perhaps very wealthy. Something to reflect on is that the richest 10% of people globally are responsible for around half of the world's CO2 emissions. So the wealthy people who are able to go to places like Iceland are the most responsible for causing climate change. This leads possibly to an opportunity, and this is a project that I'm working on at the moment with a colleague who runs a glacier tour company in Iceland, as well as people who work for the University of Iceland, to see whether the experience of walking on a glacier for the first time and experiencing that beautiful landscape, but then also seeing how it's changed, and we're doing that through using virtual reality to see how that landscape has changed through time, whether that experience can be emotional enough for people to really see the problem of climate change and some of the complexity of the situation, with a view to maybe changing how they live their lives, or probably more importantly, who they vote for in elections when it comes to things like climate policy. So although there's a problem of over-tourism perhaps, and there's negative consequences, there are also opportunities and perhaps ways that we can change people's minds or influence people. The final thing I'm going to talk about is natural hazards. And this links back to the idea of Iceland being this kind of social media poster country with these picture perfect landscapes. And it is a beautiful landscape. But I think one of the dangers of social media is that people see these pictures and assume that they can go and take the same pictures and that that's a safe thing to do. And by and large, that is the case. But also, Iceland is a dynamic and real landscape. It's not just a figment of social media imagination. And there are lots of different hazards in Iceland that are well understood and can be managed, but coupled with that explosion of tourism, can be problematic. So there are potential landslides, which the bottom left picture shows. There are dangerous waves on some of the beaches, which the picture on the right shows. Unfortunately, given the boom in tourism and the number of people coming to Iceland, it was probably going to happen that people start hurting themselves and unfortunately dying. And in recent years, the number of tourist deaths has increased because of the large number of visitors, and most of those are people doing quite foolish things where they've been warned not to do them. But it does lead to problems, and that's obviously going to be a problem for the visitors, but also for the Icelandic people who have to kind of live with this day to day. So it's a complex situation where Iceland has this natural beauty. It's a fantastic landscape. It's really interesting from a physical geography point of view because we've got these active processes, the volcanism, the glaciation, the rivers, the coastline, really interesting processes all working together to create a dynamic and very beautiful landscape. Social media has found out about that amazing landscape and has driven this massive increase in tourism. And this has had those positive and negative effects that I've talked about. It's boosted the economy in some areas, but it has changed people's lifestyles. Iceland was historically a fishing and farming nation, and it's now tourism is a significant part of its lifestyle. So the local lifestyle has changed dramatically. The local economy has changed dramatically. Some of that has been positive, some of it is negative. And the difficulty is the speed of that change and how that can be sustainable. So overall, there's a complex tension between balancing the experience of tourists to have a good time and see this beautiful landscape in a sustainable way, and the income that brings to the Icelandic economy. But that's balanced against the local lifestyle and how things are changing and whether that is okay for local people. It's having an impact on the environment. So can we manage visitors to Iceland to make sure that the environment isn't too negatively affected by that? There is this issue of consumption where people are flying around the world to go to places like Iceland and contributing to the carbon emissions that are driving a lot of the change that's affecting Iceland and the rest of the world as well. And then finally, there are these tensions around safety. We're putting people into a natural and real landscape where there are real dangers. If people want to get Instagram pictures, they don't necessarily have that same education as people who are more interested in that landscape. So there are tensions around safety and responsibility of local governments and so on. So I hope that's been a useful insight into a very dynamic and interesting landscape, but also how people interact with landscapes in complex and nuanced ways.